in things, in life, in organic life, in all that surrounds us, that somehow speaks of something, and very indirectly. I don't want to pin this down to this speaks of the Creator. No, it is just something that goes beyond.
Na Timothy Radcliffe, de algemeen overste van de Dominicanen, en Enzo Bianchi, stichter van een religieuze gemeenschap in Italië, vandaag in het Braambos de Vlaams-Amerikaanse hoogleraar Louis Dupré. Louis Dupré werd geboren in Veerle. Hij studeerde filosofie aan de Universiteit van Leuven, waar hij promoveerde met een studie over Marx. In 1958 werd hij hoogleraar in de Verenigde Staten en vanaf 1973 doseert hij godsdienstfilosofie aan de Yale Universiteit in New Haven. Daar woont hij ook, aan de Amerikaanse oostkust tussen New York en Boston.
What are your most precious childhood memories?
Well, the area where I was born, that was very important to me. It's a very quiet, almost meditative area. You have these enormous pine woods from one abbey, the Abbey of Tongerlo, to the Abbey of Averbode. And in between that I was born, and that whole landscape influenced me very much. It's sort of resting in its own silence almost. It's a landscape of memory. And I have never forgotten it. It has influenced me, and I like to go back there all the time. I feel that the environment in which a person grows up is very important. And in my case, it was the most important thing. Of course, the landscape was very much mythologized by what I read about it and around it. So the Abbey of Averbode had an enormous press, particularly for young people. And we grew up with that kind of literature. And we somehow animated the whole landscape with what we read. And then later there is this Flemish writer who lived there, and or at least who grew up there, Ernest Klaas. He was the one who mythologized for me that landscape. So it was an area that made it almost impossible for me ever to live in a city. Yeah, I like this silence, and as you see, I tried to surround myself by silence again here.
Louis Dupré publiceerde 14 boeken. Een van zijn hoofdwerken, The Other Dimension, werd herhaaldelijk heruitgegeven en ook vertaald. Een verkorte versie ervan, in het Nederlands, ligt bij ons in de boekhandel met de titel De symboliek van het heilige. Maar voor de godsdienstfilosoof Dupré begon het allemaal met interesse voor Marx.
He is very important because his critique of our culture was the first, or the most fundamental at least, secular attempt to bring back the pieces of a culture in one synthesis, in one view. And that he does very well. And in fact, it is, to a great extent, the impact of my study of Marx that brought me to the study of religion. Of course, I grew up as a religious person and was never anything else, I hope. But what Marxism did was, here was a synthesis of reality that I very much admired, and which at the same time showed such a basic lacuna. Something was so basically absent, namely the sense of transcendence. There was no transcendence in Marx, and I felt that this was something that I couldn't quite live without. That something was essentially missing. This is not what life is all about. This is not what reality is all about, much as I admired it. What I admired particularly was this synthesis, this bringing together of everything. And so then I started teaching occasionally a course in philosophy of religion, and slowly this built up.
What's the relation between intellectual life and religion?
Yes, and that for me was always of crucial importance. I think that without some kind of spiritual life, that intellectual life becomes compartmentalized, becomes fragmented, becomes specialized in a way that is no longer personally satisfactory. Now, when I say spiritual, of course that is a much broader concept than just religion. Spiritual life is also what you find in art, in literature. So I always felt that an intellectual life, an academic life, had to be at the same time some form of humanist life.
It's very interesting what you say, because I always wondered whether a philosopher can really believe, in the sense that a philosopher has to ask questions, has to doubt reality. And so, can he believe?
Yes, the problem is, of course, for a philosophy, the transition to faith is, of course, always to find out exactly what the status, what the nature is of what people are then calling religious truth. If you take religious truth to mean a literal reading of the Bible and so, of course, it's impossible. I mean, there is no contact whatsoever on that level, I think. But at the same time, philosophy itself is an aspiration, is a desire, implicit, at least in philosophy, for something that is not rational, that lies beyond it. And so the main thing, I think, when it comes to the study of religion, is to discover how this kind of truth, if you want to use that word, is different from philosophical or rational truth. And in this particular case, I would say it is really the most important thing that you have to do is to discover the nature of symbols. A symbolic truth is very different. It's from the, let us say, a mathematical truth, or from a purely equation of reality with my mind. It's truth of disclosure. Something comes through here that I had not seen before. And that kind of truth is the kind of truth that is in literature, in poetry, and also in religion. And it cannot be reduced to the kind of rational reflection that as a philosopher you make and you do all the time. There is something of a different nature here altogether. I think that something similar happens in poetry or in art. These things have always been very important to me. They are the spiritual aspect of intellectual life, which is not so much intellectual as it is revealing, disclosing. And that disclosure is what religion has to the highest, gives us to the highest extent. So to expect a literal truth from religion is really not the thing to do, certainly not for someone who studies it philosophically. But to see what is the meaning, what is revealed, what is disclosed through these symbols. I think that is important. And that was the question that fascinated me.
Why are we today not open to symbols anymore?
Yes, that's an interesting question. Why is it that our time seems to use, in one way, more symbols than ever, and in some respects is totally obtuse to symbolic language? It's totally close to it. This is particularly the case with respect to religion. In the late Middle Ages or early Renaissance, the emphasis came to lie all too exclusively upon the literal interpretation of things. Not so much upon the symbolic. The medieval culture is full of symbols. And suddenly there is this turn to the literal meaning. We have this in late medieval theology, you also have it in the Reformation. In Luther, back to the letter, Calvin, back to the letter. And of course this was necessary, particularly with respect to the Bible. Erasmus showed that all these strange symbolic meanings that had been put into the letter of the Bible, or into the text of the Bible rather, were quite absurd. You have to know what the text says. But then developed that split between the literal and the symbolic. And I think that was a great loss, because at that point we lose, I think, to a great extent. Of course, people are never consistent, they never do it that way, but if we do it that way, if we lose the symbolic, then we also lose, I think, the possibility of entering into the religious world. And this is one of the reasons why our intellectual world is so thoroughly secular. Now, this is amazing because, as I said, on the other hand, we are quite open to symbolism in art. But in religion, there is always this tendency of literalism, and this leads very often then to fundamentalism and so on. Positions which are very full of tensions that will sooner or later break, I'm afraid.
You think so?
Yes.
What are important symbols to you?
To me, nature, as I told you, has always been very, very important. To take a walk, to look at nature.
You call this symbolic too?
Yes, because there is, going through a pine wood, something is conveyed that is more than trees. There is a meaning in things, in life, in organic life, in all that surrounds us, that somehow speaks of something, and very indirectly. I don't want to pin this down to this speaks of the Creator. No, it is just something that goes beyond. And of course, in theology, the same thing. I am not a theologian, but I enjoy reading theology. It enriches me to the extent that it is not just an exegesis, not just a literal interpretation of this, that, or the other thing. There is a meaning that is beyond the words. There is a silence through which the religious symbol penetrates. And that, I think, is important.
So maybe there first has to be silence before you can understand the
Yes.
symbol or the religious meaning.
Yes. Our attitude is not particularly conducive to silence today. As you know, everything is
No, especially not
faxing
in
and
America.
humming and making noise all over the place.
Yes.
There is a, if one wants to discover the spiritual in life, I think there is always a necessity to withdraw from the ordinary. Not in the sense that I am no longer part of this world, that I don't want to participate in. No, no. You have to be active, but at the same time, there is this inner distance, an inner silence, that creates a gap between me and the immediate. And it's only through that silence that I can truly perceive symbols, I think. Certainly symbols of transcendence, symbols of God.
Bijna 40 jaar woont Louis Dupré nu in Amerika. Hij is gastprofessor aan talloze universiteiten en ontving enkele eredoctoraten. Hij werkt nu aan een nieuw drieledig cultuurfilosofisch werk. Thema daarvan is de kritiek van de moderne cultuur. Het eerste deel verscheen in de Verenigde Staten met de titel Passage to Modernity.
For religious people, they also begin to wonder, as the pagans did when the Roman Empire collapsed, what is going on? What is there left? Is this the end of a Christian culture? And to some extent it is. To some extent it is. I think the so-called Res Publica Christiana,
The end of Christian culture that we're living
Christian
now.
culture, yeah.
Yes.
That, I think the culture is no longer Christian. And it would be an illusion to think it is. Now, that doesn't mean that individuals living in this culture cannot be very religious. In fact, they are more so than before because they are no longer carried by the culture. They have to make their religion, so to speak, has become a personal decision. If you want to be religious, you will have to say, yes, I am going to look into these very serious matters. They feel that whatever the sacraments, the church, religious rituals and all that is, there's always more there than meets the eye. And the mistake of many Christians is that they, and of other religions, and Jews as much, that they want to reduce it to what is clearly definable. And I don't think you can do that. You can make definitions, but then you would say, well, yes, but these are definitions about God. I would say that I, who have now devoted the last 25 years of my life primarily to the study of religion, nevertheless, would say that I don't know more about God than any atheist does. The fact that we know that we do not know when we speak about the realm of God, that we do not know that God is always greater than what we say about Him. When we read a psalm, we can receive some inspiration or devotion from that, but we always know that this is not what it is. And the whole mystical tradition is built upon that. I mean, is it not revealing that those women and men who are closest to God are the ones who say, no, we don't know. The ones who are closest. Eckhart will speak about God. He's not a being, he says. In a sense, says Eckhart, literally, he is not. He's beyond all that. In our country here, there's too much talk about God. If you run for president, the first thing you have to say, God and motherhood and things like that. And then there's also in America particularly a tendency to take everything quite literal, so that it develops into a fundamentalism. God is a person who sits up there and
do they have that image?
it's unbelievable, yes. Many simple people. Well, the whole story that we had recently of that massive suicide at Heavenly Gate people is pathetic. It's pathetic. These were deeply religious people. Christian people in a way. But they felt that this whole science fiction that they get from television, all of that is mixed up with their religion, and they know what God is all about. If you listen to a radio program here on Sunday morning on driving your automobile, you will hear, and the Lord told me. Well, there is this man sitting up there. All of that, of course, won't wash. This does not work. God is beyond all that, and I repeat, there is something to be learned from the fact that the most mystical, the most religious people are the ones who say that first. I think that Christians, in some way, have to go beyond dialogue.
Beyond dialogue?
Beyond dialogue.
What do you mean by that?
That it is not just a question of how can we be good neighbors without killing one another. And without... The record of religion is very bad in this respect. The intolerance of religion in the past was very bad. Namely that if someone had another conviction, the best thing to do is to kill them. You have no problem left at the end. And some of that was still visible in Bosnia-Herzegovina recently. So these things die very slowly, these bad habits. It is not enough to say, yes, of course we are willing to let you survive. We are not going to kill you, but you are wrong. We are right. I don't think that's correct. I don't think that's the right attitude. I think if Providence lets us survive, lets us live in our religions, both of us, there must be something there. And I think that is an aspect of a belief in Providence, to believe in the sacred meaning of what other people believe. This also means that tolerance is not enough. I think now that the East has come closer to us, I think we almost have the obligation of whatever is useful there, whatever helps us to understand our own religion, has to be taken, has to be very closely observed and perhaps studied for people who have the time for doing that. I think that particularly in a time when the problem is noise, is action, that to go and to become acquainted with methods of silence, of contemplation, of meditation, is a very good thing. The relation between religion and moral habits is a very intriguing thing, because on the one hand, one must admit that people can be very moral without having any religion. And it is very unfair for Christians or other religious people to say, well, without religion you cannot be moral. That is just false. One of the most moral people I've ever known in my life was a judge, a federal judge in Washington, whom I got to know quite well. He had no religion whatsoever, but he was such a conscientious person, much more than I am. So that you cannot say that morality is religious in that sense. But on the other hand, and this has always intrigued me, there are people, now let me put it this way, how is morality discovered? Let us start with Saint Francis of Assisi. When Francis meets that leper on the road and embraces that leper and kisses him on his wounds, did he do something moral? No, he didn't. It was something disgusting. And yet, at that moment, morality was raised to a new height. Something broke through here, something became new, different. Take closer to home Mother Teresa. Is Mother Teresa a very moral woman? I hope so, but I don't know it. But what she did, you could say, from a utilitarian point of view, this was not the best thing to do. Instead of helping the living, she picks up the dying from the street. All this energy could have been spent on living misery. The dying people, they're not suffering anymore. Why did she take them? The moment she did it, morality changed. We discovered something. Morality has to be invented. It is the highest of human attainments, and yet it has to be invented. It's not something that is given there. It is something that is an exploration, an invention, and who are the great inventors of morality? People who couldn't care less about morality, like Francis of Assisi, Mother Teresa, Bernard of Clairvaux. These people were not concerned about being moral. That was the last of their concerns. But they were concerned about that which they saw to be supremely important. And once you change the beacons on that, once you change the light on what is important, you do more for morality than when you observe the law, I think.
What do you think is the most urgent problem of present-day society?
In what sense? In religious sense?
General. What requires our attention most now?
Yes. I think a conversion of our attitudes. I think the general attitude in our culture is not correct, I think. And
You mean of consummating
well,
goods, materials?
it is not sufficient to say, let us turn back to religion, for example. That's not going to solve anything as long as you do not become internally converted.
Converted to a religion
Converted
or
to
to
another. No,
attitude?
before we get to can be converted to religion, we have to be converted to a different attitude to life. An attitude in which existing is more than taking, and in which acting is more than making, in which there is openness and therefore also a sense of otherness. One of the things that is most missing, in spite of all our talk of the other and our talk about ecumenism and the talk about the person in the society who is non-recognized, there is very little sense of otherness. Very little perception of that. I think if there is one thing one negative characteristic next to many, many good ones that you would have to apply to modernity increasingly, is the absence of a sense of otherness. We say, well, we speak about the other all the time. We're very tolerant. We say, particularly in the United States, we have these strange educational methods of pluralism. In America, they start pluralism before they know their own language or culture. But it's all one big mass of pulp. You know, it all goes to the same grinder. And by otherness, I mean the sense to wait and to listen and to see whether the other has something to say to us. You were talking about Marxism. I think a perfect illustration of what I was trying to say now is that when the wall collapsed, as people call it now, when the wall collapsed, what was the attitude? I mean, communism was in fragments, was collapsing on all sides, and it disappeared in an incredible short amount of time. What was the reaction of the United States? Immediately, they sent their emissaries there, saying, now, straightforward capitalism. Well, here are people who for 70 years have had nothing but misery under communism. Now they get, without any transition, a system that is going to be in the first years, the first 5 years of relaxation, is going to be perhaps more cruel. We were a hairbreadth from a return to communism at the last elections, because people say this is worse, and it was. Now this is an example of a lack of perception of otherness. But there is a point where you feel that humans are cogs in the machinery. They're wheels. They function. Life is more than function. And living is more than making and fabrication and making money. It's not important. I mean, it's not that important, I think.
What role do you see for religion and the church in the 21st century?
I don't see religion as a role. I see religion as a dimension. And therefore, I know what you're saying. I mean, organized religion. How should it work? How should it? But I think this, even in a very non-religious time, if religion is truly a part of humanity, as I'm convinced it is, then it will never go away. The problem is, at this point, that for many people, that impulse, that desire, that longing has lost many of its past outlets because they did not keep pace with life, or we felt that they were obsolete, or what have you. And so if religion has no rational, and by rational I mean things that make sense, outlets, then it will create irrational ones. And look at, you know, Waco, Texas, Heavenly Gate, one strange cult after another. I think that the church will fulfill, the organized church will fulfill a major role, or can fulfill at least. What it will do, philosophers make no prophecies, but what it can do is to catch that by keeping up with it, by producing saints, people of heroic virtue, and also by studying, by learning, and thereby by keeping pace with the intellectual development, because our culture is an intellectual culture. It's one of the highest sophistication that ever existed. And if they do that, then they will be able to catch, to guide people in wise ways to what they ultimately desire. And at the same time, when religion has that guided impact upon our world, then religion also will be a very beneficial thing. It will help culture to keep its balance.